I'm going to record this one because that's a really great question. And I think a couple of folks are going to be wondering the same after going through this stuff. So, all right, the question is: are there any career fields that are focused, really kind of putting climate change and all of that kind of front and center? And so, there's good news and bad news on this. On the one hand, uh, there's a case to be made for um, most careers actually touch this in some way because, you know, we cannot live without a functional climate. And compared to what the next 100 years and really the next couple of centuries are going to be like, we've had many centuries of a so-called garden earth climate where it's warm but not too hot, it's cool but not too cold, um, regular regular infusions of enough precipitation, but not too much most of the time, infrequent droughts, that sort of thing. And so, all that to say, like, no matter where you work, you have to eat, you have to have breathable air, clean air, survivable temperatures, regular rainfall and stuff like that. Um, so, in a sense, there's again like every possible career touches this in some ways. Like if you're a farmer, are you doing carbon positive farming and spraying a bunch of nitrate fertilizer and putting uh, NOx compounds into the air, or are you doing like carbon negative, low till, no till, permaculture, that kind of stuff? All the way on up to, are you an atmospheric physicist or chemist who's working on modeling some of this stuff and like a very, very specialized, advanced, you know, narrowly focused on specifically doing the climate modeling and stuff like that. Um, in the political arena, unfortunately, we all have to kind of try to survive under the decisions that our political leaders make and enforce. And so there's a case to be made for going into public life, public servanthood, whether in the political sphere or as like a public employee, like for the Park Service, for example. Foresters, of course, we're taking care of the habitats. We are going to be doing most of like the trillion tree planting across the world that everybody else is really needing for us to do. Um, Teachers, elementary school teachers, right? We started hearing a lot about environmental degradation in elementary and grade school in the 90s and the aughts and the teens from teachers who were frustrated about not seeing this being talked about anywhere else. Stay-at-home dads, stay-at-home moms. How do you run your household? Are you using a whole bunch of single-use plastics? And that sort of thing, or are you schlepping glass containers or metal containers to a grocery store that lets you fill stuff in bulk, like the co-op does? Mm-hmm. And that sort of thing? Or are you just sort of living according to the script put out by Coca-Cola and other organizations that in the 1950s and 60s switched the entire planet over to single-use metal and plastic and increasingly plastic containers? And we know how our oceans are kind of turning out with that result. So yeah, on one like the good news is that anybody has an influence on this. The bad news is everybody has an influence on this, and this is just not front and center as a main thing for most people. So the climate for the first time ever has reached double digits, like low teens, as far as like the most important issue for voters, like determining how they vote, for example. So that's awesome. That's like more than it ever has been. The problem is, of course, you've hopefully seen some of the studies announced that say we have until 2030 to really get pretty much every emitting nation, which is all of them, on a carbon neutral footing so that we can get carbon negative, by 2050. Um, and I don't see that happening, not in a long shot, which means that, we're looking at, um, we haven't really talked about the different climate modeling scenarios yet. That's kind of our next step for this class. But yeah, so Sweet Emmy and I were out for a walk this morning before work, and we were walking by the Center for Medical Arts, which is a local like doc in the box urgent care facility. And they have social distancing and quarantine measures in place because they have respiratory patients who are particularly vulnerable to COVID-19. And so there's a whole bunch of people sitting in the parking lot this morning at, I don't know, 8:30, whenever it was, just idling their cars so they could have a little bit of AC and charge their smartphones while they're just scrolling while their loved one is inside getting medical treatment. And it's that part of it that I think we're gonna really, really struggle to overcome as a species in order to survive past 2100. So, like running an internal combustion engine to charge a cell phone is ridiculous. It's profoundly, profoundly wasteful. Running the engine on a big old, extended cab dually pickup truck in a parking lot for a little bit of AC and charging a smartphone is even more ridiculous. And we saw a couple of those, and we got to breathe their air shed as we were walking by a couple of times doing laps. So, everybody has a stake in this. Like our children are going to be the ones who are wrestling with the inputs or the outputs of our decisions kind of right now, and really the decisions of everybody since about 1700 when the Industrial Revolution began, and we really switched heavy into coal and oil and other petroleum fuels as an energy source. Super convenient, and to the extent that we have our way of life kind of defined around just absurdly easy and cheap energy, that's something that we are going to have to confront. Like, I've got a lot of videos usually for the intro to forest rec class where we show stuff like, a guy or gal, water skiing along, and they're not getting pulled by a regular, just like small motorboat. It's like one of those super long, super boats or like a cigar boat that can go 80, 120 miles an hour. And you certainly wouldn't water ski at that speed, but it's a huge, huge set of engines and that sort of thing. And so you think about that boat as a proxy for millions of other boats and recreational vehicles and stuff like that, emitting a bunch of carbon, causing occasional more direct environmental impacts like hitting a manatee and chopping up its back with a prop or something like that. We'll see, saw some of those photos over the summer. And they emit that carbon, and that carbon is going to be in the air for a couple of centuries, heating up the planet for a couple of hours worth of afternoon entertainment so we could feel like we're having fun, we're having a good time water skiing. So do you see how absurdly cheap energy is?
Yeah.
Okay. And that's come to kind of define our American way of life. Like we are, if you don't have a car in the United States, it's going to be very difficult for you to work. The way that most of our communities are physically architected, and that was a very deliberate thing back in the 1950s and 60s, building out subdivisions really in the post-World War II environment. The auto manufacturers didn't want America to go the way of Europe and like Far East Asia, where they rely very heavily on rail transport. And so they did a lot of things to make sure that Amtrak and the public subsidies for rails were just dismantled and stuff like that. So I forget what the statistic is. Like rail transport can pull a ton of freight a mile on 1 gallon of gasoline or something like that, or 100 miles or whatever it is. It's like orders of magnitude more efficient carbon wise than running a bunch of semi trucks over the surface of the road. But this is America, so we don't use those, you know, commie swine train systems. We have our own cars, by God, and trucks and everything else. Um, and we have this thing called fast fashion, where people will design and sell T-shirts for a limited print run of, you know, 10 to 1,000 shirts or whatever, and it's some pop culture reference or witticism from a TV show or something like that. And we consume that. It's cool for the next year, and then it's just like an out of style T-shirt. But all of the carbon and all of the water that's used to grow cotton, huge amounts of water, sucking very large lakes, completely gone off the face of the earth in Eastern Europe, um, and in places where we shouldn't really be growing water intensive crops like Egypt, where those things are sold for a premium. Egyptian cotton sheets are super fancy, partially because it's insane to grow cotton in Egypt. Um, anyway, so we use carbon to live a life of wealth and ease that people like Louis the 14th, the Sun King of France, a couple hundred years ago, Louis the 14th personally used less energy than many of us, just like regular Americans do on a day-to-day basis. So when you do the calculations or the conversion from one sort of recognizable form of energy to another, our lifestyle gets us to a spot where we are literally each consuming or spending, if you like, the equivalent of anywhere from 50 to 200 or so human slaves. So think about a pharaoh or a plantation more recently, or there are modern human trafficking practices in lots of parts of the world as well these days, and that's not okay. But it is one kind of a unit of energy. Like, how much work can a single person exert in a field or transporting products from one place to another? It's not really necessary, but a lot of people have come to feel like they rely on that sweet, sweet free Amazon Prime 2-day shipping, and we just spend a lot more energy to do that. There's tons and tons of logistics that go into that. So it's fearsome. It's amazing the kinds of things that humanity's been able to achieve with a very high energy return on investment, or EROI, which we'll talk about in class, where we'd spend a calorie getting 100 calories of energy out with oil. Now it's anywhere from 10 to 3 calories out for each calorie that we put in. So the EROI is dropping as we've sort of crested past peak oil and we're dropping back down. And one of the sort of cardinal rules of management of any kind, so not just recreation management or even just forest management in general, or just management in general, one of the basic fundamental rules of that is that as a manager or as a leader, providing things for people, people remember. And you can give, but you can't take away. So when, in your role as an educator or a forester or whatever other career you decide to go into, you say, hey, we can accomplish the same thing a different way and lighten up the load on our atmosphere and give ourselves a livable planet, give our children a livable planet. But we're going to have to wait one more day to get that cheap plastic crap that we got from, manufactured in Southeast Asia, China, shipped over on some massive ship into an Amazon warehouse. We might get that one day later. And, we can live with that for a tenth the carbon impact of having stuff like now, right now, like same day delivery. Um, and people are not cool with that. Like it's like you're telling them to sacrifice their babies. Like it's amazing. Um, the stranglehold that we have allowed our leaders to put on us and so forth, um, in the name of perceived personal freedoms. So there's a lot of ways in which I see we can kind of, um, in a whole bunch of different careers, keep kind of rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, or we can push for some meaningful and smart changes. For example, the switch to electric vehicles. So one very relevant career field for helping humanity to survive this transition from, um, being utterly drunk on carbon fuels to a more sustainable kind of steady state, um, system is switching over to electric vehicles, right? Like straight up battery electric.
Mm-hmm.
We can generate electricity a lot of clean ways. We have the technology, we have everything. Um, but you know, there's this whole subculture of people, as it turns out, who will key Tesla vehicles when they run across it in a parking lot. And Teslas have security cameras that have 360 coverage. So Tesla owners started posting these, and it's just like it's like regular Chads and Karens and so forth, if we can use those sort of pejorative terms briefly. There's some problems with that, but whatever. Um, it's like soccer moms and dads just like walking out with their groceries, and they'll just whip out their keys and run it right along the Tesla because the Tesla is a threat to them somehow or something. Like somehow switching to a sustainable system is scary to a lot of people. They equate that with, political subjugation. I don't know. I don't identify with that. I don't understand it, but it is a thing. Um,
Yeah.
so yeah, super long answer to your very fair question of what career should I go into if I want to be a positive force for sustainability and making sure that climate doesn't become a problem. And the good answer is all of them. This terrifying to me answer is all of them. Um, the entire medical industry is completely built on single-use plastics, and single-use plastics are almost completely built on petroleum fuel extracts,
Yeah.
sort of the byproducts of making gasoline. So, um, yeah, medicine, education, obviously land management, engineering for things like vehicles, but also the logistic systems that those vehicles are used in. Like, you know, currently our entire economic existence is predicated on a service economy in the United States. We don't really make anything in the US anymore, except for random Kickstarter, like boutique industry type stuff.
Mm-hmm.
We've offshored that. We've sent it to other countries where we are comfortable with them having the pollution of that manufacturing and then shipping the products back to us on ships that use fuel that is so nasty. Barge fuel, so large open ocean freighter fuel, is so nasty. It's solid at room temperature. It's literally tar. Um, and you can walk across the fuel tanks of these things. And so they have to burn fuel to heat up that tar so they can pump it into the engine, so they can pump all that carbon out to the air. And I'll have to find the specific statistic, but it's something ridiculous. Like the largest 50 ships put out equal carbon and particulate pollution to all of the other internal combustion vehicles in the world, like a
Wow.
billion cars. These ships are huge. Some of them are fractional miles long, and they're just constantly going back and forth and sending us cheap plastic crap that's going to break. So we got to order more stuff for when that breaks, and so forth. So, man, this when you take a step back and look at the carbon cost of kind of anything that we do, um, we have more clothing than anyone in history. We have more stuff than anyone in history. We have more everything. The only way that we are ahead in terms of sustainability from some other countries is that very lately, like very recently, younger families have decided against having kids. And having children is one of the single largest carbon contributions ever. Like, um, we'll do this exercise here in a bit as a class, but we'll have everybody calculate their carbon footprint. So typically using a couple of key indicators, how many tons of carbon is my individual life contributing to the atmosphere on a yearly basis? And there's a little bit of slop with it, like it's maybe 10% higher or lower one year versus another year because of whatever, maybe travel a little bit more, a little bit less, whatever. But generally speaking, those carbon footprint calculations are really pretty good. Like there's a huge amount of science that's boiled down into those simple calculations. So it's stuff like how many flights over 3 hours do you take per year? How many shorter flights? Do you drive a car? Do you drive a hybrid car? Do you drive an electric car? Do you walk and bike instead and you don't even own a car? All of those things put the typical American, I think, around 20 tons of carbon per person into the atmosphere based on all of those lifestyle choices. Do you eat red meat? Do you eat non-red meat? Are you vegan? Where are you on that spectrum? All of those things. The size of your house, all of that. And for the typical American, I think it's around 20 tons. For Emmy and me, it's like somewhere like 15 tons. We drive a hybrid vehicle. We try not to eat a lot of red meat, stuff like that. And none of that matters. Like, it doesn't matter what kind of life you have if you have a bunch of kids. Not like you individually, just like anybody having kids. Because not doing that completely just erases that potential person's future carbon contributions across their entire 85-year lifespan coming up. So again, that's one of the few ways in which highly educated, highly developed nations like the United States are kind of out in front of other places. Unfortunately, the huge amount of carbon that we each put into the atmosphere as Americans outstrips the fact that our families are sort of rapidly shrinking in size in highly developed nations. So, for example, a family in Bangladesh might have 8 or 10 kids, but they're still putting out a tiny fraction of the carbon that we are, even factoring in all of those kids, because we're just so completely, like, carbon fuels have such a chokehold on us in the U.S. It's unbelievable. And it's, of course, become a political issue, like, different politicians tying up with, the petroleum industry in general, or coming out in support of coal miners and stuff like that. Like, okay, coal miners are people too. They have the need of dignity of a good profession and stuff like that. But, if any particular industry is wrecking stuff, then let's give them the dignity of some awesome contributing career, but that doesn't give us a ton of carbon into the atmosphere and kill us all off in the end. So, yeah.
So, I know this is kind of a hard question, but do you think it's actually realistic in any way for people in their personal lives to make those changes and for that to be what reverses things? Or do you think we need to focus more on business decisions?
That's a really great question. That's a very nuanced question as well. I'm really glad you brought that up. So, the answer is yes. We absolutely have to, in order for the Earth to support a population of more than 1 billion people, according to all the research and modeling. Like, we've got really pretty sophisticated models on this stuff, and it's no longer surprising except in the fact that things are collapsing faster than we thought. But all that to say, we have really, really good guesses on where things are going and how they're going to get there. And the answer is yes. We absolutely, absolutely have to do the right thing individually.
Okay.
And it's also not hard to do the right thing individually when you've got governments and non-governmental organizations and private companies also tugging on the rope. Like, for example, the first model Tesla, and I'm using them as sort of a proxy label for just battery electric plug-in vehicles, because that's a shorter phrase. But Tesla is not the only show in town. This is not an endorsement of Elon Musk, whatever. But like the first Tesla vehicle that came out was super expensive. It was like $75,000. And it didn't even have that great of range. Like, it was a sports car aimed at the top end of the market. Because it was super expensive, they were getting their process all set up. Their third generation vehicle, super cheap. It's like a regular sedan. And its carbon footprint is tiny relative to that of other things. And the folks tracking the minerals needed to build computers and lithium batteries and sodium polymer batteries and stuff like that, I did the math. We have enough lithium to replace every internal combustion engine with a lithium polymer battery powered engine, like all billion plus vehicles right now. And then we're out of lithium. Like, that's it. But the good news is, in this transition, we are also getting technologies in place to recycle that lithium, recondition those polymers, remanufacture batteries instead of pulling new lithium out of the ground. We're also working on carbon capture technologies to suck carbon dioxide out of the air and blast it into basically huge porous caverns underground to form carbonate minerals. And that's very hard to do without causing a so-called climate warming whiplash effect if we ever slow down on that. So scary stuff. But so the answer is yes, we need to do better. We need to individually do better, and take a look at what it means to be happy, what it means to be American, what it means to be a human being, a fellow human being on the face of this planet. Like, ultimately, if the United States and China and Russia and so forth, and then in like individual smaller countries that pop up every now and then, like Indonesia with all those peat fires, like if any one of the top 6 emitters or carbon polluters doesn't sort of cotton on to this whole idea of, look, by 2050 at the latest, like 2050 is drop dead, not good odds for great things afterwards, cutoff for getting the entire planet carbon neutral in its emissions, then if any one of those 6 don't do it, then the entire rest of the world fails. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Like, even if everybody else is being carbon neutral and in a few places starting to get carbon negative, like doing carbon sequestration kinds of things, any one of those top 6 are so far out ahead of the rest that it doesn't work. So we're all on the same lifeboat, is the metaphor from the 1970s for environmental activists back then. Like, yeah, we can go to the Mars and we can go to the moon, but really not in our lifetime. I mean, not in a permanent self-sustaining kind of way in either of those places. Like, those are not options. And even if they were, we're not Elon Musk. We're not getting on that rocket. Like, that's somebody else's, that's some billionaire's gig. So, yeah. And countries can absolutely do it. There's an economic means, and this happens at the very highest policy levels, Darren, where you have countries basically charging the cost of remediating carbon emissions to the industries that are generating that carbon at the front end of the process, not so much at the far end of the process, like, you know, when I jump in my little hybrid sedan to head to campus or whatever, in lieu of riding my bike to campus, um, I'm technically the one emitting the carbon. Um, but other places, like in Europe, for example, they don't, the government doesn't pay oil companies to produce gasoline, called a subsidy, like we do in the United States. Um, and so, you know, a gallon, what we would call a gallon of gas, so 3.8, 3.9 liters of gas in Europe, it's like $7, $8, which is insane. Like gas is $4 in the United States per gallon, and people lose their minds. Like this is it. It's over. Like how am I going to get my chicken tendies? You know, um, and that's a thing because we've addicted ourselves so thoroughly to carbon fuels. Um, but when you internalize those costs, when you factor in the actual costs of fixing that problem, and you charge it to the gasoline producer, um, then that actually reflects the real and total cost of what that fuel producer, or that carbon source, if you want to think of it that way. It's not really about fuels, it's about carbon sources. Um, that's a huge amount of money. And so a lot of sustainability focused economists are pointing out that, look, when you crunch the numbers, we'd actually get a check from BP and Exxon and all of these other companies. Like individual Americans would get a check from these companies paying for the damage that they are sort of causing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So this
Like
is,
a tax, kind
yes,
of. Yeah.
yeah. So there are different ideas about this. Cap and trade, just straight up tax, stuff like that. Um, but it can work very well. The idea being that, look, we can charge a $1.90 to $2.50 to $3 for a gallon of gas now, and pay literally trillions of dollars, like numbers approaching the entire annual size of the US economy, trillions of dollars in the year 2100, when the same city is getting hit by 5 hurricanes in a row, and each of those causing billions of dollars in damage. And instead of the one little derecho in Iowa, which destroyed a third of Iowa's crop production at the moment, having a derecho like that every couple of days somewhere across the country, and paying lots and lots and lots and lots of money to ship in millions of tons of grain from other places on an emergency basis, because most folks aren't keeping, weeks or months or years of food supply stocked in their homes. That's a lot. So to answer your question, to sum up again, it's about individual responsibility. Like, I am making choices, for example, to not fly to professional conferences, which is sad because professional conferences are awesome. Like you walk around these show floors and these different companies just like give you free stuff. Like you can win iPads, and they'll give away vacations to places. Like my wife is a veterinarian, and her trade shows and conferences are unbelievable. Like they will throw hundreds of dollars and enter you in contests to win thousands of dollars of stuff. But we had to spend carbon to get there to do it. And we don't have to. Like that's a choice, totally. And in some ways, that could potentially be a career limiting choice. Like I learned about this job that I'm working right now, as an SIU professor, and I love this. This is amazing. Like working with you guys is amazing. I learned about that at a conference from a professor who's no longer working in the forestry department. She wandered over at one of the like afternoon just mixer sessions. Everybody's got a beer in their hand. They're just talking, just like networking, stuff like that. And she's like, "Hey, I hear your PhD studies are coming to an end. We're about to float a job announcement for a recreation ecology professor at SIU Forestry. It's going to be a couple of months, but I'd love to see your name in the hat if you want to throw it in." And 12 years later, here I am. And that happened at a conference. But I just can't justify putting carbon into the air for the sake of my career at that scale. So flights are extremely carbon intensive. They're one of the most carbon intensive things that you or I as individuals can do. Totally. So yeah, it's partially down to personal choices like that. And then it's also down to the political courage and the will to make big policy changes, like most of the rest of the world already is. America's not leading in this at all, really at all. And just having, a president and a Senate and a judicial system that say, hey, we can't commit crimes against future generations for the sake of a little bit more ease or profit today. Like, our forebears didn't really get to do that to us. That wouldn't be cool. And it's reached a point now where this is really genuinely a planetary existential threat. Yeah. So that's the recap to the question, which also became kind of long. So the recap did, not the question. All right, let me hit stop recording on that one, and we'll go to the next question.